All right, so our speakers tonight, Dana Nuccitelli is an environmental scientist and climate journalist with a master's degree in physics. He would love to explain quantum physics to anybody who has time to talk about it. He has written about climate change since 2010 for Skeptical Science, The Guardian from 2013 to 2018, and since 2018 for Yale Climate Connections. Our other speaker tonight is Jennifer Tyler. You can call her Jen. She serves as CCL's Director of Government Affairs in Washington, D.C. Jennifer has spent over 7 years in public service before joining CCL, serving mostly on congressional staff, including as the Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for former Congressman John Katko. She has developed strong relationships throughout Washington on both sides of the aisle and has extensive experience successfully crafting and advancing legislative initiatives. Our goals for this evening include to get a better understanding of what's happening with wildfires and what's making them worse, learn about the proposed solutions in the Fix Our Forest Act, and what we'll be asking of you in the days to come to support this legislation to help fix our forest. And without further ado, I will turn it over to the aforementioned Dana Nuccitelli.
All right, thanks, Ricky. So, yeah, we're going to start off talking about a little science and data related to what's happening with wildfires, starting with this chart, because you guys know how much I like charts. This is data from CAL FIRE showing the acreage burned in California in each wildfire season since 1987. And you can see there's a lot of year-to-year variability because some years the weather happens to be colder and wetter, some years it's hotter and drier, the latter making better conditions for large wildfire seasons. But you can see this long-term trend here. This is the trend line. We are trending towards, on average, bigger and bigger wildfire seasons. We had some really big ones in recent years as well. And this year, 2025, we've of course seen the big wildfires around Los Angeles. There was just an attribution study by the scientists at World Weather Attribution, which what they do is basically run a bunch of climate model simulations with a world without human greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and then with human greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and they see the probability difference of these kinds of extreme weather events happening in those two different kinds of worlds. And what they concluded was that the hot and dry and windy conditions that were occurring when the Los Angeles wildfires broke out and expanded really fast were about 35% more likely due to global warming, and those conditions are now expected to happen about once every 17 years. And if we get up to 2.6 degrees Celsius, which is right now about what we're on track for based on current climate policies around the world, we're on track for around 2.6 degrees warming by 2100. If we get there, then that will make these kinds of conditions another 35% more likely than they are today to happen in the Los Angeles area. There's also very low rainfall this fall in that area, October through December. Those conditions are now 2.4 times more likely to happen thanks to global warming. We'll talk a little bit about why that is in a few minutes. And we're now seeing 23 extra days per year of fire-prone conditions in this area. So why is this happening? Why are wildfires getting worse? Couple of reasons. You can put them in kind of two buckets. One bucket is, of course, climate change, which we'll talk about that in detail here in a minute. The other bucket, you can kind of call it forest management, which comprises a few different things that are happening. One, we had colonialism replace indigenous cultural forest burning. That used to happen. Now it doesn't happen so much anymore. As a result, basically, by preventing this kind of natural wildfire burning and human-assisted wildfire burning, then the forests got much more dense. We implemented a policy of very aggressive fire suppression, where we essentially, over the past 100 years or so, tried to put out fires as quickly as possible. And so the forests were burning less, which allowed vegetation to build up much more densely, and they eventually reached a point where it became very dense and thus susceptible to very large, out-of-control wildfires. We also, at the same time, started doing some timber harvest practices, removing very large trees, which tends to result in dense, smaller trees in a given area, which are also prone to spreading very large wildfires. And this is according to a study published a few years ago. So that was forest management. Of course, there is also the role of climate change, which we know we have global warming, and so we have hotter temperatures, which basically means more energy in the system, helping the fires spread. We also have drier vegetation. If you want to get nerdy, as you know I do, it's called the vapor pressure deficit, which is when the atmosphere is hotter and essentially thirstier and kind of sucks moisture out of the soil and the vegetation and makes the vegetation drier and thus more prone to acting as wildfire fuel. For similar reasons, we're also seeing longer and more severe droughts, also categorized as mega droughts when they last for more than a decade, as has been the case over the past few decades in California. Longer wildfire seasons, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Maybe changes in the jet stream, which are related to changes due to global warming, changes changing the Arctic, which causes the jet stream to get these wobbly, wavy patterns. And then in the waves, you can tend to get weather systems get stuck in those locations. And so if you get a high pressure system stuck in one spot off the coast of California, it can push rainstorms to the north and prevent the rain from falling in California. So maybe that played a role, but that's still kind of cutting edge science that's still being kind of ironed out. And so we can't say for sure if that played a role here. And then the other question is the Santa Ana winds, which played a big role in these Los Angeles wildfires being particularly bad because it was super strong winds preventing the firefighters from getting the wildfires out of control. So the question is like, did climate change impact those Santa Ana winds? And that's another area where the science is still ongoing and uncertain. And some research suggesting the Santa Ana winds could get weaker, some suggest it could get stronger in a climate changed world. So it's not really certain at this point. It's also depends on the time of year, for example. So that's more uncertain as well. But one area that we do know is playing a role is those longer wildfire seasons. And so that's illustrated in this chart from a 2018 paper led by UCLA climate scientist Daniel Swain. So what we're looking at here is this black dashed line across the middle is the average rainfall in each month of the year in California. Just kind of average that out. And then colors darker green is further northern California, darker brown is further southern California. And we're looking at projections of how rainfall is changing in California in each month. So we can see like December, January, February, the winter months, these lines are all above the black line, meaning that California is getting more rain in the winter months, but the opposite is happening in the fall. The lines are all below the black line, meaning that rainfall in September, October, November, the fall months, particularly in Southern California in October, November, is decreasing. And California's got this Mediterranean climate where it basically doesn't rain in the summer. I'm a lifelong California resident. Whenever anybody from somewhere else talks about raining in the summer, I'm like, what do you mean rain in the summer? How can it rain in the summer? It doesn't rain here in the summer. So the dry season starts over here in the summer, which is not illustrated on this chart. And then the wildfire season starts, and the wildfire season ends when we start to get rainfall in the fall. But if we get less rainfall in the fall, it's just not happening. It's taking longer, then the wildfire season goes further and further into the year. And also in the spring, the same kind of thing is happening. We're getting a less and less rain, especially in April and May, which means the dry season starts earlier. And so you get these shoulders around the summer months where that dry season starts earlier in the spring, extends into the summer, and then extends further into fall. So you get longer and longer wildfire seasons as you get less and less rainfall in those earlier and later months. And so this is a chart from a 2016 paper looking at the causes of wildfires getting bigger in California. This is cumulative area burned, so you're looking at adding the area burned in each year to the previous years. The yellow is the area burned without climate change, and then the orange is the additional area burned because of human-caused climate change. And you can see they concluded that human-caused climate change roughly doubled the area burned in the Western United States since 1984. And so it's a big factor, but it's not the only factor. So again, the other factor is the forest management bucket of things that we're doing. So this is another chart from a study published a few years ago where the gray and the red here is showing the amount of biomass burning, so basically wildfires in the Western United States, and kind of averaging that out. And then the black dotted line is showing the area that we would expect to have burned given the climate, given the temperature and the dryness. at the time, and you can see the black and the gray and the red match up very closely until about 1900, and then they diverge. And the area that actually burned goes way down because that's our kind of fire suppression, excessive fire suppression forest management period. And then the black is showing the area we expected to burn because of global warming, temperatures went up, dryness went up, and so you would expect the area burned by wildfires to go up. But instead, the area burned by wildfires went down because we were suppressing those natural wildfires. And so in this paper, they called it the late 20th century fire deficit, that the fires were not burning nearly as large as we expected them to burn based on the changing climate. And so basically what that means is that you've got this high density of forest that's not burning. Instead, it's staying in place. It's becoming very dense and it's becoming hotter and drier. And that creates the conditions for really big wildfires. So then some consequences of those big wildfires. One that's not so good is that we lose the carbon storage in those trees when they burn. The carbon in their woody biomass gets put back into the atmosphere and adds to global warming, which we don't like to see. That's bad for everybody. It has impacts on local wildlife, of course. It creates a lot of wildfire smoke, which research has shown is very, very bad for people's health to breathe. You get lost lives, lost possessions, lost homes, all the trauma that comes along with that. You have the costs to recover and rebuild all of those destroyed homes and property, which then also creates big insurance costs, which I wrote just recently wrote this article for Yale about the what extreme weather like wildfires, but also hurricanes and flooding and hail are doing to our insurance prices, which even if it doesn't impact you, the extreme weather doesn't impact you directly, you are in the insurance pool that is getting those costs spread around. And so all of our insurance rates are unsafe. And if you're interested in that, I would encourage everybody to read the article. So let's figure out what some solutions to this problem are. So one thing you can do is harden your homes and your communities. Do things like if you're in a wildfire risk area, clear some space around your home without anything flammable to try to protect it as well as you can. And protecting your community is one thing that's an option. Sometimes is useful is doing managed grazing, which is something that's done in my city actually, because we have some undeveloped areas where a lot of weeds tend to grow. And so we bring in herds of goats to just come and chow down on all those weeds and reduce that fire risk. And then my dog and I get to walk around and watch the herds of the goats eating the vegetation, which is kind of a cool solution. Housing policy is really important because in California in particular, we have very expensive houses in cities, and so that kind of pushes people out to what we call the wildland urban interface, the WUI, which is fun to say. But it's kind of areas closer to the forests where property and homes are less expensive, more affordable, but then they're also in higher risk wildfire areas. There's also insurance policy because you want your insurance policy rates to match the risk of the weather and the climate in the area. And sometimes we have policies that kind of don't accurately prevent these policies from accurately reflecting the climate risks and associated costs. So read my article if you're interested in that topic. Managed retreat is an interesting one. Like that's like doing things like if you have an undeveloped area of high climate risk, doing things to discourage development of that area, so you're not encouraging people to move into high climate risk areas. Or if you have an area where it is being impacted by climate extreme weather, climate worsened extreme weather, potentially giving people incentive to move out of that area. Although that's very complex because people are very emotionally attached to their homes, so it's kind of a difficult topic, but something we're going to have to grapple with at some point. And then there's better and faster forage management, doing things like prescribed burns, going back to those kind of indigenous type practices of doing natural or doing controlled burns. That is a challenging thing to do because, again, you have to do that when the weather conditions are good, so that you're not in danger of those burns getting out of control because the weather is too hot and dry. You have to do it when the weather is right, so that you can keep the burns under control. But the window of time when those weather conditions are suitable is shrinking because, again, we're getting hotter and drier fall and spring months. And also, we have more people living in that wildland urban interface who don't want to breathe the smoke. And so it's a difficult thing to do. And so ideally, we would pass some policies to make that a little bit easier. Also, in a smart way, thinning our forests so that they have less dense vegetation and so they're not as susceptible to wildfires that burn out of control. And then, of course, curbing climate change is the other big solution. But that's a separate topic from today, because today we're gonna talk about the Fix Our Forest Act, in which the hardening of homes and communities is addressed, and the better and faster forest management is also addressed. So, yeah, this bill is kind of a combination of our healthy forests and permitting reform policy areas, and tries to address some of those problems. And I'm going to hand it over to Jen, and she's going to talk about what's in the bill.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. And I'm glad to be here with you guys tonight. I feel like, there's so much going on in DC. I'm sure all of you are glued to the news, maybe not as much as I am, but this is a really nice kind of break from just responding to everything that's happening. Instead, this is something that's moving forward. This is progress. It's something that we've been working on now for almost a year now, this bill, and we're seeing it move, and we're ready to get you guys all trained up and informed, so that way we can take more action and hopefully get this across the finish line. So it's a really nice start to this Congress. So I'll take a step back, and Dana's covered a bit of this, but why is the Fix Our Forest Act needed? Well, as Dana mentioned, there's been a long history of mismanagement, essentially, of our federal forests and changing conditions that have made countless acres of federal lands really susceptible to drought and wildfire. Like Dana said, we've suppressed almost all natural fires, so we haven't allowed the forest to naturally thin out as they would have before. There's also been a ton of invasive fire-prone vegetation that's grown unabated, hasn't been addressed, either through natural fires or prescribed burns or other means. And lastly, a large part of what this bill addresses is these multi-year environmental reviews that have really slowed the process down to do some critical forest management practices like thinning forests, cleaning up dry vegetation. Those kind of basic critical things that need to get done right now are taking many years to get through the environmental review process, even though there's really an urgent need to do those to prevent these sorts of fires. So what does the bill exactly do? How do we address all of those changes? Well, what this bill is aiming to do is restore forests back to a healthy place, back to a place where they're growing, they're not super susceptible to wildfires. We're increasing resiliency to these wildfires, so we're not seeing, hopefully, these summer after summer after summer of, devastating wildfires all over. And also, like Dana mentioned, that that interface between the urban areas now, or suburban areas, and these wildfire areas, it's growing all across, especially the West. But this is going to help some of those communities build fire-safe defenses. So we're talking about some of those housing and construction policies that can be tweaked to help those houses and help those communities be more resilient in the face of growing wildfire threat. Diving a little bit more into the specifics of this bill, I'll go through all these different provisions and give a little bit more background on each of them. This first one here is probably one of the biggest chunks of the bill, and we'll spend a lot of time talking on this as I go through the slides, but it really is simplifying and expediting a lot of these forest management projects. So as I mentioned, right now, there's environmental review processes that we fully support, that are necessary to make sure that all forest management practices and plans are taking into account the impact on the environment, taking into account impact on the endangered species, and they're all meaning well. All those practices we fully support. That being said, currently, a lot of those practices, a lot of those review processes can take many years. Once it goes through a review process, it's very easy for it to get kicked back into the review process if something changes. So there's a lot of issues when it comes to implementing some of those major environmental review processes. And you'll see a lot of this sounds familiar to our permitting reform arguments. If you remember, with permitting reform, we fully support all of the environmental standards that different energy projects have to go through, but a lot of those processes take way too long and have way too many barriers in them that really hold up clean energy projects. It's the same with a lot of these forest management projects as it relates to wildfires. So some of the things this bill does to expedite these environmental review processes, it expands categorical exclusions. Categorical exclusions are a federal policy that apply to infrastructure projects, energy projects, a bunch of different projects, but essentially what these say is that the federal agency has determined after reviewing it that this type of action, whatever it might be, does not have a significant impact on the environment, and therefore it doesn't need to go through an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, or potentially those statements can be shorter than normal. So these categorical exclusions already exist for a lot of forest management projects, but they only exist for now, most of them up to 3,000 acres. So you can only do a categorical exclusion for those 3,000 acres. So if you have a forest, for instance, this a good example is this Palisades fire, where it's much larger than 3,000 acres. In order to expedite some of those processes, if the Forest Service determines we really need to thin this out, it's at high risk, we know in the next year or two there could be a burn, let's do something. Well, instead of being able to do the entire forest as a categorical exclusion and move to thin the forest quickly, they have to do separate categorical exclusions for each 3,000 acres. Or they just do one categorical exclusion and they're not able to do the others. So this is a change that the Forest Service and the state of California both asked for, to expand that number to 10,000 acres. So to allow them to do categorical exclusions for larger areas so that they can quickly implement some of these important forest management activities that will address and hopefully prevent some of these devastating wildfires. Another way they went about simplifying and expediting some of these forest management projects in this bill is expanding emergency authorizations. For the past, I want to say 2 or 3 administrations, there have been emergency authorizations put in place by President Biden as well as President Trump in his first term to allow the Forest Service to put in place some of these quick forest management plans. So it's basically said there is an emergency, we need to quickly allow them to take action. That's a bipartisan policy that's implemented under both Republican and Democratic administrations. This bill continues to allow and codifies those emergency authorizations into law. Reducing the threat of frivolous litigation and preventing some of these redundant agency consultations. You'll remember this is also a very common permitting reform refrain. There's a lot of litigation when it comes to Forest Service, forest management projects right now with the Forest Service, but a lot of those litigations are brought by the same group. The vast majority of those litigations fail, and the Forest Service prevails, and they are taking many years through these court processes. So what this bill does is it requires legal challenges to be brought quickly. If you know there's a problem, you have to bring it up quickly, and you also have to make sure that the plaintiff is participating in the rulemaking process. So instead of someone coming in at the end, last minute, and tying things up in court for 4 or 5 years, they have to be engaged throughout the rulemaking process to try to help make the forest management project better along the way. And lastly, there's a certain provision, and this is a little in the weeds, so not necessarily something you have to remember, but there's a provision right now where if there is a consultation on a forest land management plan because of, say, an endangered species is found in that area, the land management plan will go through a review. They'll talk about how they're addressing that endangered species, and then it can be implemented, that land management plan. Now, if there happens to be an additional endangered species found or evidence of a specific habitat that might be in threat, all of a sudden that entire land management plan has to go all the way back through consultation. That's a very lengthy process. So this bill essentially says it doesn't have to go all the way back through that consultation process. They do have to still take some steps to address these things. They're not just blazing right through without any regard for these additional endangered species or habitats, but it prevents them from going all the way back to the beginning. to restart some of those consultations. So really speeds things up in the courts and also those agency consultations. And then another thing that we really loved and we wanted to have included in permitting reform is early and often community engagement. This bill includes that for forest management projects. It creates different fire sheds and other things that I'll talk about in a minute. And as it creates these different programs and grant funds, it includes local communities. As the Forest Service is designating certain areas high risk for wildfires, it's incorporating local community feedback to talk about how can they best address it. It includes technical assistance for local communities, grant funds, making sure they have access to innovative and cutting-edge technology and wildfire suppressant technologies. So there's a lot in there about how can communities engage early and often as these fire sheds are designated to help inform both the state governments, the federal governments, and public-private partnerships as to how they can best address some of these wildfire threats. Additionally, I kind of touched on this. There's a lot of investment in innovative fire detection, suppressant technologies, and modernizing construction standards. So when the bill has a bunch of different grant programs, but there's several that are really focused on how do we take this problem that we have, and we know roughly what works, but we're not really investing in R&D. So there's a few different research and development programs in the bill that make sure that we're not just addressing this with the current technology and firefighting capability we have, but how can we be more forward thinking, do some research and development, come up with better technologies to address these wildfire risks, address wildfires as they come up. And a lot of that happens to involve construction standards. We've heard a lot of talk in California already about rebuilding these homes and what that's going to look like. What are some of the different building standards that will come into play? Well, this bill includes both grant funding, but as well as some direction to federal agencies and state, local, federal partnerships to start thinking about that, to really come up with a plan, come up with best practices, and have that technical assistance available to local communities. So not just is this bill investing in that research and development, but then it has a pathway to make sure that information is getting to local communities that are impacted by these wildfires or at risk for wildfires. There is an interagency fire shed center created. This is kind of what I alluded to with that early and often community engagement. The Fire Shed Center, it is a pretty broad encompassing new creation in this bill that would take a lot of things that are somewhat happening on the federal level, put them in one space, and make sure that it is not just happening within the federal government, within the Forest Service, or within the Bureau of Land Management, but it's happening on that level in direct consultation and coordination with state governments, with tribal lands, as well as with local governments. So the Fire Shed Center, they designate a bunch of different fire sheds, different areas that are at risk for wildfires based on which ones are most susceptible and highest risk. It comes up with plans for those fire sheds, and it makes sure that local communities, state governments, tribal leaders are brought into those conversations to help work on those areas and mitigate them. And there's also funding associated with that center to make sure they're able to address them. Providing support for wildland firefighters, there's provisions to make sure that firefighters know what they're going to get paid. Often these things are happening quickly. Firefighters are responding in an emergency, and it's not clear what funding is coming to them, when, from which jurisdiction. So this helps give some certainty to them, make sure they're getting reasonably and well compensated for what they're doing, and allows that process to be a little more streamlined as this happens more and more often. And then hardening utility rights of way against wildfire. Right now, utility rights of way really only go for 10 feet within rights of way. So 10 feet from a power line, for instance, the utility company has the authority to deal with that vegetation. That's not anywhere near enough when you're talking about these really, really broad, wide landscapes. So this bill expands that to 150 feet. It gives them more right of way to deal with that dry vegetation that's really just a tinderbox right now for these fires. So that's a pretty detailed summary of what the bill does. Let's talk about what's happening, because like I said, it's really exciting. So the legislation was first introduced last Congress. That's when we first got engaged. We endorsed it on the national level, our team, the CCL team, started lobbying in favor of it, went out to a bunch of different offices. We didn't quite mobilize you all yet because we were so focused on permitting reform last Congress. We had our hand in a bunch of different things. But this Congress, it's been reintroduced and it was really quickly moved to the House floor. It passed last Congress with a bipartisan vote in the House, so that's why it was able to move to the House floor really fast this past month. It passed the House recently by a vote of 279 to 141. And as you can see, there were 215 Republican yes votes and 64 Democratic yes votes. So I want to highlight this. A lot of climate bills, environmental bills, we tend to think are Democratic leaning. There's more Democratic votes in favor. We really need to focus on the Republicans, is what I hear a lot of people say. Now, as we're leaning more into this permitting reform work and things are changing, the challenges that we're battling are different. It's switching sometimes, and this bill is a good example of that. There's a lot more Republican support for this bill than there is Democratic support. There's no Democratic support. It's a very bipartisan bill, as you can see, with those 64 Democratic yes votes. But really, a lot of what we need to make our argument on, and a lot of the convincing we need to do, is going to be on the left side of the aisle. Now, between last Congress and this Congress, we've seen some really good improvement on support for the bill. There were 9 more Democratic yes votes this Congress compared to last. We saw additional votes from members in the Historic Black Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus, from Democratic leadership, as well as some progressives. So we're seeing things shift. We also saw 24 California Democrats vote yes and only 15 vote no. So you can see the impact from these wildfires. When it's happening on the ground, the minds of members are really changing. So the bill has passed the House. We're thrilled about that. And now it's awaiting consideration in the Senate. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Here is a list of supporting organizations. I bolded some of the ones that I think might be relevant as you all start thinking about your member and what argument might make sense. But some highlights I'll point out: the National Congress of American Indians. It's really hard to have a land management bill supported by the National Congress of American Indians because it's a high bar. They have really, and rightfully so, high standards for what they want to make sure the federal government is doing. They want to make sure they're included and it's collaborative and respecting the rights and values of those tribal lands. So this is a big endorsement there. So if you have a member or you have tribal lands in your district and the member cares about that, that's a really good one to highlight. The American Forest, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. There's some good environmental groups who are endorsing. And then there's also some industry, some utility folks. So there's Edison Electric Institute, there's the National Rural Electrical Co-op Association. So there's some different folks depending on what you think your senator might be most keen on hearing from. There's different groups that you can kind of pick from. All right, now let's get to the fun part. There's, as you might have heard, there's a good amount of opposition to this bill from some of the environmental groups out there. I'm going to go through the major opposing arguments and our response to those arguments. We feel really solid here in our support for this bill, as we do in our support for permitting reform. We have to really move these things forward in order to make a difference, and there are some changes that need to be made to how we permit things, how we get things done. And that includes some tweaks to environmental processes and standards. And it can be scary, I know, when we talk about categorical exclusions and things that might impact environmental reviews. But if we're not acting quick, as we see in California, forests burn. So our argument about endangered species is irrelevant if the forests are all going to burn and those species are going to go with it. So the first big argument that people have against the bill is that it's undermining these core environmental protection laws like NEPA. Our response to that: the bill doesn't alter or amend NEPA or the Endangered Species Act in any way. It does provide these emergency authorities like expanding categorical exclusions and some other emergency authorities for the Forest Service, but those are only as it relates to dealing with some of this wildfire risk. So these are warranted given the growing risk. It makes sure that if we're talking about endangered species, we're talking about endangered habitats, we need to preserve that habitat. And we can't do it at the rate we've been doing it. If things are taking 4 years to get approved, the forests are going to burn while we're negotiating on that forest management plan. And that doesn't make any sense. But NEPA and all of those environmental review processes are still very much in place. This does not modify them in any way. Another argument, it exempts logging from environmental review. This does not allow all of a sudden for the Forest Service to start logging every forest in the country. It does allow for categorical exclusions, like I said, to be increased to 10,000 acres, but all the practices in this bill that it's meant to allow are scientifically proven methods to reduce wildfire risk. So if that means thinning out a forest, if that means dealing with vegetation, that's what would happen under that forest management plan. It does not all of a sudden open the door for all of this logging and industry to come in and just log and clear cut every single forest. Preventing citizens from holding federal agencies accountable, that's the pushback on some of the litigation provisions. But this, again, it places this bill, this forest management process on the same playing field as many surface transportation projects, energy projects, and aviation projects. The litigation process is way too lengthy as it is with a lot of these projects, and so we're seeing these different forest management projects held up for years and years. And this just makes sure that we're streamlining things. There's still a pathway for litigation if it's necessary and is reasonable, but it makes sure that a lot of those frivolous lawsuits are not coming up. Next steps. All right, so now is a great time. If your member voted in favor of this bill, and we included a link here in the presentation, now is a great time to send them an appreciation, post on social media, thanking them for that support. It's a lot of House members, as you saw, over 200 Republicans, 64 Democrats, so I'm sure a lot of you will have some thank yous you can send out. And just express to them how meaningful it was, especially those Democrats who might have been getting some pressure to vote no. The fact that they voted yes was a really positive sign. In the coming weeks, we're going to start giving you guidance on the Senate side. Please don't start reaching out just yet because we are holding off to figure out exactly the most strategic time and the best message to bring to the Senate on this bill. As soon as we're ready for you to reach out to your senator, we will let you know. But in the meantime, look through this PowerPoint, start thinking about the bill and think about what specific angle is going to be relevant to your member. What do you think are the arguments that are really going to cut through and get to your senator and convince them that this is a bill worth supporting? So spend that time, work within your chapter, figure out what those arguments might be that you think you can bring to your senator.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.